which we characterized as the Black National Anthem. That's what we called it, the Black National Anthem. I could still do all the verses if you want to hear them, but my voice is going, so we can't do it. We celebrated Frederick Douglass's birthday. We were way beyond, you know, the peanut. And, you know, we did Charles Drew and blood plasma. We weren't worried about George Washington Carver. We were beyond that. We played Paul Robeson's songs were played on the loudspeaker system. That was the kind of environment those teachers created. By the mid-1950s, they were all gone. Every single one of them was driven out of the system by the Red Scare, by McCarthyism. And, you know, this is kind of trying to prove a negative, and, you know, these are difficult things to do, but I have a conviction, which I'm putting in the book, even though, you know, it's something that comes from the gut, not from any kind of scientific measuring. Recall 1967, in Brooklyn particularly, in the very area that I grew up in, or close to that area, a big battle broke out over what they call community control of schools. Under the impact of the vast movement of, you know, the accelerating black liberation movement during that period, you had a school system which was overwhelmingly white, and it's a tricky, complicated problem. A vast number of those teachers happened to be Jewish also. Now, a lot of them had moved away from their working class roots, and, you know, the relationship between teachers and kids in the school system in the 60s was not a very healthy relationship. It certainly was not like we had at PS 35 in the 40s. I've always maintained, and it's something, of course, that you'll never be able to prove, but you kind of know it in your gut, that had those teachers not been driven out of the system, the struggle between the teachers and the community over what was called community control of schools would have been of an entirely different magnitude. Because as it is, this was a very transforming moment, because this was during the period of the Six-Day War, this is during the period of the growing antagonism and alienation, largely because the social base of the Jewish community had changed dramatically from working class to middle class to a very large extent. And the conflict between the teachers' union, the AFC, led by Shanker, and the community was incredibly intense. And you had this weird situation of the teachers going on strike against community control. And you had these progressive, younger progressive students, many of them from the Ivy League, stepping in and crossing picket lines in order to help educate the kids. So it was a convoluted situation. It was very different from what we ordinarily would experience. But that PS 35 was really the most impacting experience, I think, upon my own development. Anybody know who this is? Remember anything about this? This is a guy named Isaac Woodard. Not Woodward, as sometimes noted in some literature. This is 1946. He was in uniform. He was a decorated soldier and had just been mustered out of the service. He was traveling by bus from, I think, Charleston to Columbia, South Carolina, to his home. At one point, he asked the driver if the driver could pull in, as the driver could pull into a rest stop, that he had to, you know, use the facility. The driver accommodates, but then as Wood goes to use the facility, the driver hails the local police. As he's getting back on the bus, he's dragged off the bus, presumably because he went into a segregated restroom. Perhaps that never was even abundantly clear. They beat him mercilessly, and they literally gouged his eyes out while he was still in uniform. He was permanently blinded as a result of. And as a 14-year-old kid at the time, it had a devastating effect, a deeply troubling effect. As a matter of fact, it did cause, because of the outrage, particularly the returning veteran from the anti-fascist war and the like, the outrage was so intense that Truman was forced to appoint this Committee on Civil Rights which eventually produced the document to secure these rights, which was not a bad document at all. Called for an end to poll taxes and segregation and for fair employment practices and the like. But the attack on Isaac Woodard was manifest of what was going on during this period, and it's something that the history books have not really seriously looked into and dealt with. You had at the end of the war this tremendous cresting sense of anti-fascism, you know, which was linked in the minds of many people as anti-fascism was equated to anti-racism, and that the struggle against Nazism, and you know, now an awareness is beginning to emerge about the Holocaust and the like, the notion really of racial oppression and the need to stamp it out, to hold true to the country's democratic aspirations became a very big issue. And the momentum within black communities, particularly to make the promise of World War II a reality, accelerated. The result of all that was that there's a kind of a blowback, there's a counterattack against the black community. It's going on for about, throughout the late 40s and early 50s. Incredible number of cases of physical violence and outright murder, and not just in the South. One of the biggest cases was a couple of cops gunning down a whole family of black young men, 4 or 5 of whom were returning veterans in Freeport, New York, which was a big scandal in 1946 and 47. But you had literally thousands of cases of violence against blacks at different levels, as if to say, you have a democratic dream as a result of this great victory over fascism, forget about it. We're pushing you back. We're going to keep you down. And that was not only in the South, but it was all over the country. And the Woodard case was manifest of this. This is my first political action on the street. Anybody know what this is? Who this is? The woman named Rosalie Ingram. And those are 2 of her sons. Rosalie Ingram was a tenant farmer in rural Georgia, and one of her farm animals got onto the property of this white farmer who had been harassing. She was a widow, and this guy had been harassing her for years, you know, making these sexist comments like, oh, your husband's dead, you must need a man, you know, that kind of thing. And anyway, the farm animals go on his property. She and the sons go to retrieve the animals. The guy starts yelling, gets into an altercation, physically assaults Mrs. Ingram, and the 2 sons beat the guy to death. So all 3 are convicted in a very quick summary trial in 1948. They're all convicted of murder and they're sentenced to death. And I was in a little group of the American Youth for Democracy. We had a little group of about 12, about 8 or 9 were black, 4 or 5 white, whatever. We hit the streets with petitions and with information on Rosalie Ingram, and that is deeply etched in my memory of the shock of the community, the way people kind of rushed to us, snapping up leaflets and asking for information and the like. I also remember my first lesson in red baiting. The New York Amsterdam News, or the main black newspaper in New York at the time, they had a Brooklyn edition in the Brooklyn office. Photographer from the Brooklyn Amsterdam News comes around and is about to take a picture, you know, to publicize the whole thing. And then he notices on the literature, American Youth for Democracy, left-wing organization, and he splits, he just runs out, you know. But this was my first involvement in any, you know, organizational way. What is Jackie Robinson doing in this? Well, first of all, that's one of the great transforming moments. And baseball is a national pastime. And Jackie Robinson represented this enormous step forward, even though, of course, there was, at that moment in time at least, only the barest sense of the kind of devastation that the old Negro Leagues would suffer as a result of the desegregation, let's call it, of Major League Baseball. But I was a